years ago, I learned about entrepreneurship. And because I taught business courses for so long, one of the courses I taught was Introduction to Business. And we always went through this session on entrepreneurship and what is an entrepreneur. And an entrepreneur is a risk taker. Now, I learned that from you and Milton, and particularly you, because in order to be an entrepreneur, you must be a risk taker. And I wasn't, and my husband, your dad, was not as much of a risk taker as you were. And that troubled us a little bit, but we saw how successful you were being a risk taker, and I assume you're still a risk.
Calculated risk.
Calculated risk.
So it's, you know, you and Dad. I'm going to jump back. How did you guys meet?
Oh boy, we worked in a district government agency on what is that street? South Dakota and what's that street that crosses South Dakota Avenue and near Rhode Island?
Oh,
no, out that way, going far northeast. And there were government agencies that rented space in those buildings. And I was driving at the time, and he took the bus. And occasionally, anybody who got off the bus had to walk up this steep hill. And I'd stopped every now and then to pick him up to see if he wanted to ride up the hill. Of course, he did want to ride up the hill.
So Dad was hitchhiking?
He was hitchhiking,
okay.
Yes. And that's how we met. And somehow we started dating from that point. And it, you know, ended up in a marriage for so many years and 2 boys.
Well, that's a lesson, I guess. If you're better than the dating app, you could just pick up hitchhikers and maybe find your future spouse.
Yeah, that worked back then, and we laughed about that for years. You know, because that's how we actually met. Because he worked for a different government agency in the same space up that hill,
and so then we're fast forward. So you know, purchased an investment property prior to the wedding.
Right, and it was just, you know, we said we want to live in a house. And it was a small semi-detached place, and it worked. And then we decided that maybe it was time for us to move into a larger space. And that's when we found a place for sale about a block away from where we were currently living. But we sold the house that we originally were in.
And then use the money for that, put down on the new house, and then ultimately use the money from that to move into a little further south. In Prince George's County.
And then at some point, I don't remember the first year that we bought an investment property, but we realized that you needed some money to do that. And that, you know, once you get started, and you had to learn about tenancy and what it means to have a tenant and how to work with tenants. And there were lots of lessons that we learned by dealing with. We had good tenants, bad tenants. We still have good tenants and bad tenants. Primarily more good tenants than bad tenants. But there are lessons to be learned from that, though.
Yeah, and then also, yeah, patience, vicissitudes, overcoming vicissitudes.
And you know, when I would teach, especially in all my business classes, somehow I would bring into the picture some of the experiences that I had. And then, of course, if there was something I didn't know the answer to, I would tell my students that that was something that I missed because I was skipped from the 1st to the 3rd grade. And so I must have missed that from not going to the 2nd grade.
You skipped. They taught that in the 2nd grade?
Yeah, they taught it in the 2nd grade. So I went from the 1st grade to the 3rd grade. And I enjoyed that.
All right. And how has, you know, real estate and investing, how has that, well, before I get to that, so what was ultimately you were a government agent and then, you know, worked for a government agency, you and Dad, you got married, then you had a career as an educator.
Right.
Both of you had careers in education. What was your career and how did real estate kind of help supplement the income from real estate?
Well, we realized in working with a real estate agent, and we worked with the same agent all the time, and when she would see how you could do a special deal, she would call us and say, hey, I know you have another property here. You don't need to spend but X number of dollars, but you can get X number of dollars in rent. And that sounded good. And I said, okay, well, that will help pay tuition. And, you know, you all were in, at that time, you were in Sheridan or one of the other private schools. And, of course, you know, we needed money for that. And so we had to make sure that we had the adequate funds. And I give a lot of credit to Beverly Farrell and her husband who worked with us and shared with us how you can make something happen. And at first, I was a little hesitant. But then, you know, Melvin, your dad, said, let's go for it. And once we did the
That was
first
good.
investment, oh
Let's
my
go for
goodness,
it.
it just
Right.
it went from one property to another. And you know, people got
another,
to
to
ask
another,
us,
to another. Right.
You're not buying another place, aren't you? Are you? And I said, well, you know, we're going to try this. And so far, but you have to be, I don't know, you have to be mindful, and you have to take risks, though. And that's what, and I think you're more of a risk taker than Milton. And he's becoming more of a risk taker than I had anticipated that he would be. But
Without
you know,
risk, there could be no reward.
well, that's true. That is absolutely true. And a lot of people still will not take that risk. And I mean, I learned also when two partners and I owned a daycare center in D.C. And that was really taking a risk. But I would always tell my students in class that just to show you that I was really not as much of a risk taker as other people were. She worked at Howard University, the other one worked in DC Public Schools, and I worked at UDC, which was Federal City at the time. And neither one of us would quit our job. But a real risk taker, one of us should have quit our jobs.
Full-time.
But we
in
wanted,
daycare
no,
centers.
we wanted to, we were afraid to do that. And I always would tell people that the reason we weren't risk takers then. And we had a successful child care center for probably 8 or 10 years, and then eventually.
That would have been in the 80s.
Yeah.
During that time. Right?
And then we ended up, you know, selling it, and you know, got out of that business. But it was good. It was a good business. I learned a lot. We all learned a lot in that business.
Yeah, you had a few. You guys had what, two locations, 3 locations?
Right. We ended up with, yeah, because what would happen is that you couldn't have it, depending upon the space, you couldn't have it so many children in your facility. So, you know, when the inspector came out and said, I see you have X number of kids, you're going to have to find another space. And just that alone was taking a risk, because we could have said we're going to stop at that point. But the need for childcare was so great, and still is great. So we ended up opening another site. And so at one point we had 3 sites, and that was challenging, because someone...
And 3 sets of staff.
Yeah, and you know, if a child, a couple of them were close to one another, and so if you didn't pick your child up at 6 o'clock, by 6:30, and we couldn't reach the parent, we would bring one child up the street to the other facility, and that helped a lot. That didn't happen that often, but those are the things, those are what we call vicissitudes. And that was a vicissitude. And even one of the greatest challenges for us was when we had to, we couldn't contact the parent, and we had to take the child someplace. And I remember taking one of the kids to South Capitol Street. There was a McDonald's on the corner, but that was years ago, and they tore that McDonald's down. And I took the child there first to give her some supper, and then I had to take her to one of the child care DC government places where they would make sure that the child was put back to her parent. But again, those are things that entrepreneurs have to learn how to do and have to accept. And, you know, taking a risk. I could have had an accident, just anything could have happened. But we were just so careful in areas like that.